Hey everyone, Derrick here. In this one, let's continue on in our Automate Remote Work series and look at how we can start using APIs. If you missed the first two videos, feel free to check out the playlist linked in the description below. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing. With that said, let's get started. Starting out, what is an API? An API, put very simply, is just a way that we can interact with websites and get information or send information to them. In this example, I'll talk you through a GET request and a POST request. A GET request is just a way that we can return information, and a POST request is a way that we can send information. Let's do a GET request now. So in Python, to interact with any sort of API, you'll probably be using requests. So we'll import that at the top. The GET request is the most basic thing that we can do, and we'll start out here before moving into a more complex example. So what we want is to set a variable, which will be the response object of the GET request. We'll just say response in this example. Now we can call that library and we'll say .get. Here we're specifying a GET request using the request library. Now we need to pass in the URL of the website that we want to send this GET request to. In this example, I created a simple API using WaveScript, and we'll use that here. What this API does is you send a GET request to it, and it will just return the date to us. We can see that by saying print. We'll reference that response object, and we'll just say text. So we're accessing the text attribute of the response. Now we can save this script, and we'll execute it. So when we execute that, what we're doing is we're sending that GET request to this URL. This URL will figure out how to process this request and return some type of object back to us. Sometimes this object is a 404, which means that that URL that you're trying to send a request to doesn't exist, or you get something back like this, which is a JSON response. Here though, what this actually is a string that we need to process into JSON if we want to use it that way. To encode and decode JSON within Python, you need to use a JSON library. In Python, how we interact with API responses is not by using text. Instead, we want to use JSON, and we can say response.json. If we print this and execute it, we see this time, instead of this string that we get back, we'll get something back that's much nicer to work with. Here, we get back a Python dictionary. Now, what we could do is we could say .get and pull information out of this JSON response that we want. In this example, we only have one key, date, and we'll access that by saying get date. What this will do is return the value of date, which is on the other side of the colon. When we execute this, we should only get back the date of this JSON response, which we do. So now we know how to send a simple GET request, and we know how to access data from within that GET request using the JSON and request libraries. But usually, sending a GET request is not this easy, because a service doesn't want to just produce results for anyone that sends a GET request. How they get around this is by using API keys. An API key is a way for a service to know who is asking for what information and if that service should provide it. Let's walk through an example on how we can use an API key to access information from some type of service. We'll create a variable called API key, and this will be the value of that API key that we get from our service. In this example, I'm using calendly, and what we need here is this API key. We'll copy this and go back to our terminal. If this API key is important to you, definitely don't show it off in a YouTube video, because what it does is give full access to your account most of the time. But for me, I'll change this key once this video is done, and I'll paste it right here. Whatever third-party service that you want to use probably has their own way of authenticating this API key. For Calendly, what they ask is that you pass a string called X token and then assign your token to that key. Let's do that right now. So what a header is something that we can pass along with our API request, which includes more information to give to that service. So we'll say header, and we'll make this a Python dictionary. Calendly asks for X token, and then we need to assign that API key to this key value. Now we want to send a request passing this header along with it. That way we can authenticate ourselves to the server so they know who is making this request. We'll create a response object. So we'll say response is equal to request.get, the same way that we did above, and then we need to pass the URL of the API that we want to call. This will be in the documentation of whatever service you want to use. For me, this URL is something that looks like this. So we're calling the Calendly API, and this is the endpoint that has the information that I want. Right now though, we're just sending a GET request and we're not attaching the headers. So we need to create a keyword argument of headers and set this equal to what we called this here, which is header. So headers will be equal to header. Now we can say print response.json, and we'll save and execute this. Once we get that response back, we see that we get some information from our account that we can access if it's important to us. Let's just walk through how we would get ID in this example. So what we want to return is the value of the key ID, which is this. To do that, we would say .get to get inside this first struct. So get data. Now we need to go inside of a list. So we'll index it like how we would any other Python list. And now we have another dictionary. So we'll say .get, and then we'll pass in the key that we want to pull out, which is ID. We'll save this and execute it. And we should just get back the ID, which we're doing. So now we know how to authenticate ourselves to a server and get information from a third-party application. Finally, let's see how we can do something a little bit more complex. Let's say that we want to access an API and send them data so they can do something with it. In this example, we'll be using a machine learning API that we can pass data to and get back a forecasted prediction of the next 5 events in our time series. This API is located at this URL, and what we need to do is to send them a post request which has our data in it that we want them to do the prediction on. So like usual, we'll need to pass in some headers. That way they know who is asking for this service. This time, the authentication, they want it as X time door key. And my API key for this is this string right here that I'll copy and paste over. We need a couple more headers this time. So let's say accept, so we know what type of data that we want back. This will just be application/JSON. Then let's do content type, and this will just be the same thing. Application JSON. These two are pretty standard in most API requests. And now we'll drop down. We'll say our response will be equal to requests, and this time instead of get, let's say post. So we're sending data with our request. We'll pass in API URL, which is where we want to send this data. We'll say headers is equal to headers, and this time we need to pass a payload. A payload is just the data that you want to send. So we can say data is equal to what we want to send. In this example, I have a JSON file that I'll pull open right now that has all this information in it. This is what I want to send to this service so they can do calculations on these values. So what we can do if we want to open a file and send that as a payload is we can use a function called open. We'll pass in that file path. Mine is in the same directory. I'll say sample data.json, and I want to read this as bytes. Once we have that, we should be able to send this post request and get back a response. Let's see what we get back by saying print response.text. We'll save this and execute it. And once we get that back, we see that that API service did forecasting on our data and gave us information back for the next 10 periods on it. If you want to use that same data to try this example out for yourself, I'll be sure to link this JSON file in the description below. And that's pretty much it for this one. The idea here is that you take these concepts and create powerful functions that will automate these processes for you. If you have any questions or comments, as always, please let me know. Until next time.